When I come back from a trip or a photo shoot, I might have hundreds, if not thousands of images on my memory cards. And I definitely do not want to edit all of those images or even keep them. So what do? I go through a process called image culling. During this process, I go through the images and delete the ones that I will never work on, the ones that are blurry, have maybe bad focusing, bad exposure, and other issues, and then select the images that I intend to edit later on. So let's talk about image culling and at what point of your workflow you actually do it. Now, some people choose to do it on their camera as they take pictures. They review the images, delete the ones that they don't like, and then perhaps even mark some of the images and star them for later post-processing. Now, we don't actually recommend this step because I've actually had my personal negative experience with this where I was going through many images and deleting them, and I accidentally would delete images that I actually wanted to keep in the first place. So it's best not to do it in the camera. However, there are two other methods that really work well, and let's talk about those in more detail now. Let's talk about the first option, which is to actually do image culling on the memory card before you transfer the images to your computer. Now, for this one, you need three things. One, as we said before, you need to have a fast memory card reader. Two, you need to have a fast memory card. And three, something we haven't talked about yet, is you need to have software that can go through your raw images, open them up, and view them at 100% zoom. Now, the benefit of this approach is that you're eliminating images that you do not need in the first place, so you're importing less images into your computer, which speeds up your import time, and at the same time, you're not wasting hard drive space. So let me show you how I do it, and let's just jump right into it. So I've got my computer powered up here, and I've got a couple of things here. So I've got a memory card that I inserted. It's a fast memory card with a bunch of images from Jordan. And then I've got my E drive. As before, we actually have a photos folder. Everything's already in there. I've got my Lightroom catalog running here. But that doesn't matter at this point because what I'm going to do is I'm not even going to open Lightroom at this point. I'm going to open up my memory card and go through that image culling process. So I'm going to open this G drive, and I've got all these images right here. So I have software called Fast Raw Viewer, and this software, as the name suggests, it really does a great job at viewing raw images fast. So that's the whole point of the software. And when I open it up, as you'll see, these are the images that I have from the trip. So I can actually go through the images one by one, start from the first one, and then say, okay, well, here are the images. These are the actual raw files. This software, unlike many other software packages out there, does not actually look at the JPEG image that's embedded into a raw file. Now remember, from our basics course in photography, we talked about this, that each raw image actually contains a JPEG image, and this software does not do that. That's something important to highlight. Because here, this is actual rendering of the raw file, and it's happening on the memory card. So if I'm looking at this image and I say, well, I don't know whether this image is sharp or not, I can actually press a button on my keyboard, which I can customize. There's a way for me to do that, and I can go through these different areas of the image and decide, is this sharp enough for me or not? And if I decide that the image was out of focus or there were some other problems with the image, I can press the delete button, and this is again customizable from the options menu. If I do that, the software does not physically delete the image. And this is something that I personally recommend against, by the way. Try not to delete images from your memory card, because if you accidentally do so, then you're gonna have to mess with recovery software to try to bring that image back. Instead, what the software does, and it's smart enough to do that, it creates a folder called rejected. And it places anything that I delete from my view here into that folder. So it doesn't physically delete it, it physically moves the image into the rejected folder. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead and go back to the 100% view, and I'm going to go through some sample images here, maybe find something that I've shot. There's a bunch of images here. So here's a good example. I've got an image here that I obviously overexposed, and this probably was a mistake. When I was in the field, I was probably too excited, took a photo and had wrong settings, maybe too high of an ISO or something else happened, and then it obviously overexposed. If I look at the histogram, there's nothing that I can do with this image. So it's basically a waste. It's not part of my bracketing here, which I have a couple of images afterwards that clearly show that. So it's clearly a candidate for deletion. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to press the delete button. The software says, do you want to move it to the rejected folder? And I can click OK. And which, by the way, if I do not want to see this window every time when I do it, I can actually turn it off as it suggests here. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Now, when I did that, as you can see, the image disappeared. And if I go back to my memory card and navigate in that folder, I can actually see there's a folder called rejected. And if I double click that and I see what's inside, it's that same image that I just deleted. Now, let's go ahead and go through a couple of more images. I deleted that one, and it looks like I've got another set of bracketed images here, which I probably don't need this one for, so I'm just going to delete this one as well. And this is part of the bracket, I know, and these two are probably part of that same bracket as well, which is fine. And looks like I've got two images here that are pretty similar. In this one right here, I actually chopped off the rock, which I don't like, so composition-wise, I actually like this image better. But another thing is, when I look through the images, I typically view them at 100% view, because that immediately tells me whether my focusing was right and whether it's a candidate for keeping or deletion. So in this case, looks like the foreground is nice and sharp, but as I go to the background, looks like I might have focused wrong here. Maybe I miscalculated my hyperfocal distance or something. So I've got another image right here. If I look at this one, I did not chop off the rock. Everything is nice compositionally here. But let's take a look if this image has exactly the same problem. So going back and forth between these two images, and that's another nice thing, is that I can switch back and forth and it remembers exactly where I was in the view. I can see that in this image right here, the background looks a lot more out of focus than this one. So I know this one is blurry and this one is a good candidate to keep, so I'm going to go ahead and delete this one. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, so this is basically how you would do it. You would go through the images, and sometimes if I have a sequence of images and I do not know which one I want to keep, I can just click on that and then press the 100% view and then just navigate through these other images to make sure that maybe pick one of the three images that looks the best for me. And sometimes, it can be something that you choose because of potential issues. Other times, it's just an image that you don't like or something got overexposed that I've shown before. So anyway, the whole point of the software is to be able to do what I just did, which is to view the images on the memory card and go through them and decide which one is going to be a keeper, which one is not. So once I delete the images, the next step is going to be identifying the images that are going to be potentials for editing. So I know this image, for example, is quite solid. There are a few other problems that I've got here. I've got some vignetting issues, probably lens corrections to apply, but I know I need to work on this image. So I've got all this XMP metadata here, and the nice thing about it, this actually works well with most other software like Lightroom, because what it does is the software does not physically modify images. Remember, raw files cannot be modified. So what it does though, it creates something called a sidecar file, and this sidecar file is going to contain any changes that I make to the image. So in this case, if I make a change by saying, well, this is going to be a 5-star image that I'm going to edit, or perhaps I mark it with a color and say I put it in a red color, this is something that is actually creating that sidecar file. If I go through another image and do the same thing, and I now go back to my folder here, I can see that there's one file that got created, and it's an XMP file. So basically, that image right there is already, when I import it into Lightroom, Lightroom will read that information and it will mark it exactly the same way, which I'll show in a second how that works. So let's go through a couple other images, and I'll just mark some other ones for, so like, look, this one is pretty decent, so I'm gonna edit this one too. Just give it 5 stars for now. And then go through, say, this one, or actually this one has a better sky and better view, so I'm gonna mark that one. So just to give you a rough idea, this is something that I would go through, maybe even this one, and just mark them. And once I do that, and let's say I color coded with this one with green, once I do that, I'm done. I can go ahead and close the software. So now I have this one folder called rejected. It has 3 images that I previously deleted, and I have a bunch of XMP files to accompany my raw images. So let's go ahead and close out of this, and I'm going to now open Lightroom. And this is the same catalog that we worked on before, so I'm just going to import to this existing catalog. And my source is still that drive. Now, here's something important here. If I just select the device here on the top left side, I do not have the option to select specific folders. So what it's doing, it's basically reading everything that's on that memory card, which is a problem in this case because I do not want it to read that rejected folder. As you can see, that image that I deleted here, for example, is still there. So the solution to this is that I have also a way to access that drive through here. So I can just select that DCIM folder, and now it's reading everything here. And as long as I have this unchecked, so if I check this, it will still read that rejected folders, but if I uncheck it, it will only read it from that main folder. So in this case, as you can see, that image disappeared. So let's go ahead and import it, and I'm not gonna worry about any of this stuff. Actually, might as well just rename this, and I'm gonna use the same preset that we created before. So I'm just gonna call it Jordan Trip, give it sequence number 1, and then the destination, we're gonna put it in 2015 folder because I know that I've captured all of these in 2015. We'll call the folder Jordan Trip, and let's go ahead and copy and import. So as it's importing the images right now, like I said, it's not even paying attention to that rejected folder that I had before, so only the good images are being imported, and at the same time it's reading those XMP files. That's the important part here, because the images that I actually marked, they will be visible in a second. And as you can see, this image right here that I marked as green, it has that green flag on it, and then here we can see that it's a 5-star image. So the image that I actually marked before, and here's the image that I marked in red and gave it 5 stars. So everything got imported properly, and I'm basically ready to go. So this is a great method for those who want to eliminate bad images on their memory card before the images are transferred to your computer, and at the same time it gives you an opportunity to mark the images that you're going to be working on later on in post-processing. Now let's talk about the other method, which is to do image culling after images are physically transferred to the computer. Now this is the method that most photographers out there use probably, and for good reasons. First of all, they might not know of existence of software that can actually do image culling on the memory card, or they might not have it. Another reason might be that they're simply tired. If I were a wedding photographer and I came back from a really long day shooting wedding, then I might not want to sit through 3,000 images and cull through them. Maybe another reason might be that next day I have another shoot, and what if I want to empty those memory cards and all I care about right now is just to move everything to my computer. So for these reasons, most photographers will be doing image culling after images are transferred to their computer. So let's do another simulation, and this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to re-import the images, and actually the first step is to get rid of all these images that I had in Lightroom. So I'm going to go ahead and delete them. And the next step is to go back to that memory card. So in this case, I am going to go to my G drive, and I'm going to delete those XMP files because in this process that would have never existed. And I'm going to move back the rejected images back into the main folder and get rid of this rejected folder. All right, so this is basically how we started early on. And what I'm going to do is go through the import process once again, basically simulating the same thing. Now this time I don't have to go into my G drive here and then select the folder because I can just import everything here. So we're going to have the same thing here, and I'm going to go ahead and click import. All right, so everything got imported. And if I were a Lightroom user and I imported everything here, my steps would be a little bit different because this time I'm going to use Lightroom to do the image culling for me. Now, I can right away from just looking at the thumbnails decide that some images are not going to work. So in this case, this image in particular, I know it's way overexposed and I'm not going to be able to work with it. So I'm going to go ahead and delete it. And I can just press the delete button on the keyboard and it will ask me, do you want to delete them from your disk or just remove from Lightroom? Now this is something important here. Remember, we talked about proper file organization. If I just say remove, it removes it from my Lightroom catalog but does not physically delete it from the disk. Now remember, when I imported these images from my memory card, they physically got transferred into a folder on my computer, into that ePhotos 2015 Jordan Trip folder. So I want to make sure that I do this right. So I'm going to go ahead and delete from disk because I do not need it in the disk separately. So I'm going to go ahead and I believe I deleted this one too, and get rid of this one. So right now it's physically doing that for me. Now Going back to that example where I was showing these two images and I said, well, I want to look at them in more detail. In this case, if I wanted to look at these images in more detail, I would double click here, and as you can see here, it's impossible to tell whether the first image or the second image is sharp enough for me to keep. So in this case, if I zoom into that area, look at how long it's taking for Lightroom to actually load that. Because the previous view here, it was something that Lightroom built for me on the fly, but when I click on the image itself, now what Lightroom was doing is it was taking the raw file and rendering a separate JPEG image. And that's why that loading message appeared on the bottom here, because it took a while for Lightroom to actually read through the file, generate the separate JPEG image, for me then to be able to see it. So if I zoom out now and go back to my main screen here in the library module and do the same for the other image, look at that. It's taking a while for this to happen. For this reason alone, I do prefer to use software like FastRAW Viewer to do it on the memory card, but there is something that you can actually do to prevent this from happening, and we'll talk about it in a second. So comparing the image before and after, I can just press the left arrow key here and then the right arrow, and immediately I can see the problem. So it took a while for the image to be properly rendered, but after it was rendered, now I can actually navigate through the images with ease and see potential problems. So here, just like in the previous example, I'm going to go ahead and delete this first image. Now let's talk about something that I haven't talked about yet, which is image previews. When I imported images from the memory card into the computer, I had an option, and let me go back to the import screen so that I can explain this in more detail. When I was importing images, I had this option on the very top right here that says Build Previews. And as you can see, it was set to minimal. So only minimal previews were built as images were imported. Now, what does it mean? Basically, when you zoom into the image, for Lightroom to be able to read that raw file in detail, it needs to first render it, because a raw file is just a bunch of data. It's not an image. So Lightroom needs to first convert that raw file into a viewable image, which in this case is JPEG. So when you import an image, you have different options here. You can generate a standard preview, which is a higher resolution preview, or there's also an option to generate a 1:1 preview. Now, if I select a 1:1, what it means, it's basically a full-size JPEG image. So if I were shooting with a 36 megapixel camera, it would literally generate an image, a JPEG image that has exactly the same resolution of 36 megapixels. And if I did that while importing, my import would actually take much longer, because first Lightroom would copy and transfer all the images into the computer, then would go through each image one by one and try to render this preview. So what is the problem here? If I go ahead and click cancel, and if I say, okay, you know what, I want to generate those previews because I actually want to go through the image culling process much faster than before. I do not want to sit and wait for 3-4 seconds or however long it takes for my computer to render that image. I actually want to build the previews. I have the option here. I can actually go into library, then click on previews, and here I've got the option to build the 1:1 previews. So if I go ahead and click that, now notice how long this is going to take. It's going to take a while, and I only have like 53 images here in my catalog that I'm actually building the previews for. It's going to take a while. So this process is something that actually made me think about this, and that's why I personally started doing image culling on the memory card. But if you have the time and you're tired and you don't want to do it on the memory card, again, you can import all of the images first and then build the preview. So you can select your 3,000 or however images you have from that wedding or whatever event that you shot, or maybe a trip, and then you can select all of them and build the previews just like I'm building them right now. Now keep in mind that when I say that it's building a JPEG, it's not actually building a JPEG to be added to your Lightroom catalog. That doesn't physically happen. What it's doing is actually generating a JPEG image, and it's placing it into previews folder that sits together with your Lightroom catalog. Now, this process is going to take time, and once it's done, you will notice that you're going to have less hard drive space now. And the reason for that is because those JPEG images, those full-size JPEG rendered images, they are going to take a lot more space on your hard drive. So, every once in a while, you might want to actually purge those previews. And there's an option right here. If I go to previews, I can actually select all the images that I no longer need, and I can say discard those one-to-one previews. And what Lightroom will do, it will go through that previews folder and just simply delete the images that I no longer need. Another option that you have in Lightroom is to discard those images automatically after a certain period of time. So if you go to Edit, your Catalog Settings, and you go to File Handling, you will see that there's an option right here which specifically says automatically discard one-to-one previews right here. And you can select a time frame. You could say maybe after a week or after 30 days. Or if you have plenty of hard drive space and you don't care, you could say never. So I personally just leave it at 30 days because chances are if I'm not done editing in 30 days, I don't think I'm going to go back and edit images after 30 days. So just keep this in mind. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. So as you can see, all this time it's still building those previews, and that takes a long time. And if I had thousands of images, I would potentially be really frustrated just sitting here through the process. So my suggestion would be only do this if you have the time. So for a wedding photographer, they might just leave their computer overnight, let the computer build all these previews. That way when they wake up in the morning and they are ready to do the image culling process, they have all of that stuff ready. All right, the previews are now finally done, and we can click OK and go back to Lightroom. And now I'm going to guide you through the basic process of image culling in Lightroom. So I'm going to go ahead and deselect these images. By the way, if you're wondering how to do that, you can just press the Control button, select an image, and if you click on that image the second time, it will deselect, or you can go to Edit and deselect. So let's do this real quick. So let's just, now that the previews are built, I'm going to just navigate through the images here, just click on an image, zoom in. As you can see, it did not say loading anymore because it's literally going through the images and loading those JPEG previews that I previously built before, which is really nice. So I can just go through the images like that, click on them, decide maybe this is blurry or not, and whichever way I do it. Now, as I do this, I could say, well, I also want to mark the images that I want to edit later and potentially mark the candidates for deletion. So if I scroll down here and say, okay, well, this image is not something I want to work on, or perhaps it's this image because it was captured after sunset, I can say, well, if I want, I can just press the X button and it will say basically the same thing as I did before. It's marking the image as rejected. Rejected means that it's a candidate for deletion. So if I mark multiple images here, let's say that one, and maybe this image right here, and then maybe this vertical right here because I have another one right here. Actually, I'm going to do this one instead. And if I mark these are candidates for deletion, I can either go to Photo, Delete Rejected Photos, and if I click that, it will say delete the 3 rejected master photos from disk or just remove them from Lightroom. Again, the same thing. I do not want to keep them on my disk, so I'm going to go ahead and delete from disk. Another thing that I can do is I could say, well, I do also want to mark the images that I want to keep for post-processing. And there are several ways I could do that. I could use this flag, for example, and if I click on that flag on the left side here, or if I press the P button on my keyboard, it does the same thing. It becomes a pick. And this pick could be a candidate for my further post-processing. Now, some photographers might actually choose to go through the images and flag them, and then only flag the images that they actually like, so that they don't have to waste their time trying to render 3,000 or so images in Lightroom, those JPEG. Remember that the process takes a long time. What they could do is they could go through the images and mark only the images that they actually intend on even looking at as pics, and then they generate JPEG previews for them. Once they do that, there's actually a way to filter through the images that are pics, and you can create a collection based on that pic, or you can go to the attribute field here and you could say only show me the images that are flagged. And when you do that, now I can select all those images and I could go back to that library previews and build one-to-one previews. So just be aware that you don't necessarily have to build previews for all the images. You can go through the thumbnails, decide on which ones you are actually intending to edit in the first place, and then, or even cull through in the first place, and then only mark those to be built for the previews for. Another thing that I can do here is I could actually go through different ratings and color coding. So for example, if I say, well, this image right here is going to be a 5-star, this image is going to be a 3-star, all I have to do is press the 5 button on the keyboard, and then that will give it 5 stars, 3 on this one, and let's just say 5 on this one. Let's just go through this process, and maybe like 2 for this one. And you could, as you give them different ratings, maybe those are your priorities. So for example, the way I do it, if I know that the image needs to be taken into Photoshop, I usually mark it with a 5-star. If I know that the image needs to be edited in Lightroom and it's going to be sufficient, like these images of food, I probably don't care about taking them to Photoshop. So I'll probably mark them with something less than 5. So let's say this could be a 2, this could be a 4. 2, likely I'm not going to edit, but it might be still a candidate that's worth looking at in more detail. And then if an image needs to be just done in Lightroom, 4, and then an image that needs to be done in Photoshop, I'm going to mark with 5. Another thing I could do if that doesn't work for me, I could say, you know what, the candidates that I want to mark for further post-processing in Photoshop, maybe there are elements that I want to get rid of. For example, in this image right here, I know there's a car. So I know that I probably want to use a better tool with all these tire tracks here and all this mess. I know I want to use something better than Lightroom's feature to do spot healing. So what I could do is mark this image for further post-processing in Photoshop through a different way. So what I could do is right-click the image and I could say set the color label to red. And when I do that, now that image in red is an automatic candidate for me for further post-processing in Photoshop. So just be aware, you can color code these images different ways, you can flag them, you can give them different ratings, and all this is something that you can later access. That's the beauty of Lightroom, is that you could then say, you know what, show me all the images that have at least 1 star. And when I do that, as you can see, it shows me all the 5-star, 3-star, 2-star images. And if I say, no, I want the images that only have 4 or higher rating, it shows you all those images. And if I say, now give me 5-star only, those are the 5 stars only. And I could combine this with other pieces of information. If I say, give me only the ones that I've flagged, those are the images that I flagged before. And if I say, give me the color-coded ones, I'm gonna have to uncheck this because I have nothing in there. But if I do color-coded red, then as you can see, it only shows me 1 image. It has a 5-star rating and it has a red color assigned to it. So just be aware that all these nice features and these filtering options allow you to do many different things. I could actually use those images further on to do different collections, or maybe tag them differently and give them different keyword tags. So there's multiple ways for me to do that. So just be aware there are so many different options here for you to go through, and I'm not saying one method is better than the other. Just figure out something that works for you. For me, the 5-star ratings are typically enough. I know Lola does color coding a lot because she needs to go through the weddings and select specific images that she's going to be using for example, albums. She'll color code those differently than the regular images. And whichever way works for you, that, as long as you stick to the process and figure out how you're going to do it, like I said, you can either delete the images or flag them and then mark them for deletion. There are keyboard shortcuts. There's so many different options. That's the beauty of software, is that it gives you all these options. Figure out what you like, figure out what works for you, and just stick with the process.